All right, so you're with us today for a deep dive, and we're going to be tackling something that I think can really transform how you approach tasks, especially when those tasks feel kind of huge or maybe even a little overwhelming. We're talking about the plan d'action.
Yeah,
That translates to action plan. Like you've got a plan, and then you've got action, and you put them together.
exactly.
So we've been digging into this great video from Mesut Özil's QSE. It's called Comment bien piloter son plan d'action. And our goal today is to give you, the listener, a really practical grasp on how to use these action plans to move from, kind of feeling passive, like, oh, this is happening to me, to really being in control and getting results.
That's right. And what I think is so fascinating about action plans is that they are fundamentally simple, yet they hold the key to some really significant improvements in how we work, how we operate, how we get things done, whether it's in our personal lives or in our professional organizations. And the video that we're going to be exploring, it really gets to the heart of why these plans work and how to make them work for you.
Absolutely. So over the course of our time together today, we're going to be looking at 4 key areas that the video really highlights. First, we're going to explore the core reasons why businesses adopt these action plans and what makes them so valuable. I think this is going to be really insightful. Then we're going to get into the structure of an action plan. What are the non-negotiable components? Like what has to be there for this thing to actually work? And then we're going to talk about strategies for keeping those plans up to date. Because, an action plan that just sits there on a shelf, it's not doing anyone any good. And then finally, we're going to get a look at a real-world tool, the action plan tool that's actually offered by Miesel Hill's QSE. So our mission today is to give you a clear understanding of the principles behind these plans and also some practical steps that you can take to actually create and use them effectively.
Sounds good.
So let's jump in. Like, why? Why do companies even bother with action plans? What's the point?
Well, I think if we think about like the fundamental challenge in any endeavor, it's about moving from intention to outcome, from having an idea to actually making it happen in a way that's efficient and that's effective.
Right.
And the video from Ms. Outtool's QSE, it points out several key advantages for businesses in terms of why they use action plans. And I think these advantages are just as relevant for individuals who are looking to, really level up their game. First off, action plans help you increase productivity and profitability. Imagine trying to navigate a complex project without a roadmap. I mean, time just kind of slips away on tasks that maybe aren't as important. Efforts become kind of scattered, and ultimately that affects the final result, and, your resources are impacted. An action plan provides that roadmap. It helps you focus your effort, it helps you optimize your timeline, and it helps you manage your resources intelligently.
Right. It's like, I don't know, like trying to assemble some flat pack furniture without looking at the instructions.
Yeah.
You might get there eventually, but it'll probably take twice as long.
Okay.
And I can guarantee there's going to be a lot more frustration involved.
Okay. For sure.
The video also talks about how action plans can help bring much needed organization and structure to your work. So by defining each step, assigning who's responsible for what, it really gives you that bird's eye view of all the different moving pieces, which can be really helpful, I think, in dialing down that feeling of like, I'm so overwhelmed. There's so much going on. Where do I even begin?
Yeah. Totally. And this becomes especially critical, I think, when you consider, just the sheer volume of tasks and initiatives that can arise in any kind of setting, whether it's at work, at home. The video mentions things like internal and external reviews, feedback from stakeholders, and addressing areas that, maybe aren't performing as well as you'd like them to.
Mm-hmm.
And without a structured way to manage all of those different inputs, they can quickly become, totally unmanageable.
Yeah.
And an action plan can serve as that central framework that allows you to organize and prioritize, keep track of all those diverse elements and make sure that nothing slips through the cracks. And you have a clear line of sight on deadlines as well.
It's like bringing order to the chaos.
Exactly.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. The video actually links action plans to the idea of continuous improvement. Specifically through this thing called the PDCA cycle, which stands for, Plan, Do, Check, Act.
Yeah.
So for anyone who maybe isn't familiar with that, can you break down how an action plan actually fuels this continuous improvement engine?
Yeah, absolutely. So think of the PDCA cycle as like an iterative process of refinement. So the plan stage, that's where you define your objectives. What are you trying to achieve? And you map out the actions that are needed to get there. Do is really just putting those plans into action. And then check is where you assess, did you hit your targets? Are you making progress? And you use different indicators to monitor how things are going. And then finally, act is about making the necessary adjustments based on what you learned from the check stage and making sure that those changes are, having the intended effect.
Right.
So a well-defined action plan, it acts as the blueprint for the plan and the do stages. It's the foundation for those first two steps. And then it provides a framework for measuring progress in the check stage. And all of that ultimately informs the act stage so you can make improvements going forward.
So it's not just about taking action, it's about taking informed action,
Right.
and then evaluating, what was the impact of that action, and then adapting based on what you learned.
Exactly.
Now, the video also touches on something that I think is top of mind for pretty much every organization, and that's keeping their stakeholders satisfied, right? Keeping those people who are invested in the organization and what the organization is doing happy. So how does an action plan help with that?
Well, I think by systematically tracking and completing those planned actions, you inherently reduce inconsistencies and errors. The instances where things don't quite meet the required standards. And while those hiccups, those instances where things go wrong, they can provide valuable learning opportunities. Ultimately, you want to minimize those.
Right.
And that's really important for maintaining, those positive relationships with your stakeholders. Action plans can also help you fine-tune your processes so they better align with stakeholder expectations. And they also provide a clear mechanism for addressing any concerns or feedback that you might receive from your stakeholders.
So happy stakeholders, healthy operation. I like it. Now, the video brings in this kind of significant aspect around meeting certain standards, specifically mentioning ISO 9001. Now, I know this might sound a little bit specialized, but I think it highlights this broader principle of having a structured way of managing things.
Right. And if we think about the bigger picture here, implementing an action plan is not just a helpful strategy for businesses that are going for, ISO 9001 certification. It's actually a fundamental part of what the standard requires. So ISO 9001, essentially, it's a framework for creating a robust quality management system. And the focus there is on consistently meeting stakeholder needs, driving efficiency and fostering ongoing improvement within an organization. And while there isn't a clause in the standard that says, thou shalt have a document called Plan d'Action, the need to plan and implement actions is woven throughout several key areas.
Okay, so let's unpack some of those key areas. The video mentions this idea of context of the organization, and I think that's a really interesting starting point.
Yeah.
So what kind of actions might actually arise from understanding that context?
So what's interesting about context of the organization is how outward-looking it is. So it requires companies to really understand, what are their internal strengths and weaknesses, what are they good at, what are they, maybe not so good at, but also what are the external factors, things like market trends or, supply chain stability that could impact their quality objectives. And then that understanding needs to translate into strategic decisions. And so if a company identifies, let's say, a vulnerability in their supply chain, that would be an external factor, right? A strategic action that they might take could be to diversify their suppliers. And so this high-level decision would then lead to a more detailed action plan that would outline the specific steps involved in, researching and vetting and onboarding new suppliers.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about identifying those potential challenges and then proactively planning your response.
Yeah.
Now, the next area that the video mentions is planning itself, which seems pretty directly linked to the topic at hand.
Yeah.
How does the standard address planning, and how do action plans fit into that?
Right. So within the planning section of ISO 9001, organizations are required to plan actions that address those risks and opportunities that they've identified.
Right.
And also to define their quality objectives. And this is where action plans become really concrete. So you'll see detailed plans emerging that specify, what needs to be done, who's responsible for each task, what resources are going to be needed, and crucially, what the deadlines are.
Right.
And so let's say, a company sets a goal to reduce customer complaints by 15% over the next quarter. That's their quality objective.
Okay.
The resulting action plan might include things like, enhanced staff training on customer service. It might include improvements to the complaint handling process. It might include, regular monitoring of customer feedback.
Right.
And each one of those actions would have, assigned responsibilities and target completion dates.
So planning is where those overarching goals, those big picture goals, get translated into these tangible, actionable steps.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, what about operation? Like how do action plans kind of fit into the operation aspect of an organization?
So, operation is all about how a company actually delivers its products and services, the doing part. And action plans are vital for ensuring consistency and meeting requirements every single time. So, let's say you have a manufacturing company and they're aiming to improve the consistency of their product dimensions. They want to make sure every single product that comes off the line meets those specific size requirements.
Right.
The action plan, in this case, might include very specific steps like upgrading the calibration procedures for the equipment, or implementing more frequent quality checks during the production process, or maybe, providing additional training to the production staff. So all of these are concrete actions that are designed to ensure consistent output.
Okay. So it's about putting those plans into practice and having those systems in place to make sure things are done correctly and consistently. Now, the video also mentions performance evaluation. How do action plans contribute to, actually assessing how well things are working?
So performance evaluation is all about measuring and analyzing the results of your processes. And this is done through things like tracking key performance indicators, conducting audits, and holding management reviews. And so if those evaluations reveal areas where, performance is falling short, let's say customer satisfaction surveys indicate a decline in, a particular area, well, that would trigger the creation of action plans to address those specific issues.
Okay.
And so you might have an action plan that's focused on improving the responsiveness of the support team based on negative customer feedback.
Right. So when your performance review highlights these areas for improvement, the action plan becomes the tool for actually getting back on track.
Exactly.
Now,
Exactly.
and finally, the last area that the video mentions in this context of ISO 9001 is improvement.
Right. And improvement is all about, this ongoing commitment to making things better. And so when issues or inconsistencies are identified, whether it's through that performance evaluation that we talked about or some other means, organizations need to implement what are called corrective and preventative actions. And those are actions that address the root causes of those issues and prevent them from happening again.
Okay.
And so let's say an internal audit reveals that there are some inefficiencies in, the document approval process at a company. The action plan might be to, implement a new digital workflow system. And this would improve efficiency and prevent, future delays. So you can see how action plans are really intertwined with the principles of ISO 9001, and they're driving that culture of continuous improvement across all these different essential functions within an organization.
It really clarifies just how crucial action plans are, not just as like a helpful tool, but often as a foundational element for effective quality management. Like they really underpin that whole system.
Okay, so now that we understand why these plans are so important, let's get into the what. Like, what are the fundamental components? What are the key building blocks of a well-structured action plan as outlined in the video?
Right. And what's so interesting about this is how straightforward the core elements are.
Right.
Yet when you apply them consistently, that's what makes the difference. And so, according to the video, a really good action plan needs to include the date that the action was initiated. When did this all begin?
Right.
A clear indication of the source of the action. Was it identified during a supplier review? Was it a result of an internal process check? Where did this come from? It also needs a concise description of what the action actually is.
Right. It needs to identify the person who's going to oversee the action. That's the pilot, as the video refers to them. And also who's going to be involved in carrying out the action. So who are the key players?
Those seem like really the essential pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah.
You've got to know what needs to be done, who's responsible, and where it came from. What else is critical for that well-structured plan?
Right. So the plan also needs a way to track progress, so a status indicator is
Right.
essential.
Right.
And that could be something as simple as, to do in progress completed.
Okay.
It also needs to include a space to note if the original timeline needs to be adjusted.
Yeah.
Things happen. Sometimes you need to push things back a bit.
Right.
It needs to have that initial deadline for completion.
Right.
And then perhaps most crucially, a clearly defined method for verifying whether or not the action has actually been effective once it's done.
Right.
Not just, okay, we checked the box, but did it work?
Right. That point about verifying effectiveness, I think that's so important. It's not enough to just, check the box and say, yep, we did it. It's about understanding, did this action actually achieve what we were hoping to achieve? Did it actually move the needle? Now, the video also touches on kind of the potential downsides of not having this well-structured action plan.
Yeah.
What are some of the risks that organizations face in that scenario?
Well, I think a lack of structure can really lead to this cascade of negative consequences. Things start to unravel.
Right.
As the video highlights, you run the risk of nonconformities during those audits. And that can jeopardize certifications, which can be, a huge problem for organizations. You'll likely see inefficiencies start to creep into your processes. There might be a lack of clarity and coordination amongst the different teams. And ultimately, you could see a decline in stakeholder satisfaction.
Yeah.
Because, issues aren't being addressed systematically. Without that clear action plan, you lack a roadmap for improvement, which makes it much harder to achieve your goals.
Those are some pretty significant risks.
Yeah.
It really highlights how having that structure isn't just about, following some kind of rigid template. It's really about protecting the overall health and trajectory of the organization itself.
Okay, so we've covered the why and we've covered the what. Now let's talk about, how do we actually keep this thing relevant, keep it useful? Because an action plan gathering dust on a shelf isn't helping anyone. So what practical advice does the video offer for actually keeping an action plan up to date and making sure it stays a living document?
Right. So this is really where the rubber meets the road. It's where we go from theory to practice.
Exactly.
And the video emphasizes that the effectiveness of an action plan is really tied to the effort that you invest in maintaining it.
Okay.
So the first key here is to be rigorous in your tracking.
Consistently updating progress and actively following up with the individuals who are responsible for each action, those pilots that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So regular check-ins, clear accountability, that all seems pretty fundamental. What other strategies does the video suggest?
So establishing regular review cycles is crucial.
Okay.
And this could involve dedicated meetings, maybe on a weekly or monthly basis, where the team actually sits down, looks at the action plan, discusses progress, identifies any roadblocks that have come up, and makes any necessary adjustments. The video also underscores the importance of setting deadlines that are both ambitious but also realistic from the get-go. You want to push people, but you don't want to set them up for failure.
Right.
And also recognizing that unforeseen circumstances can arise, and sometimes you need to revise those deadlines when necessary, rather than just letting the plan kind of become stagnant because, targets were missed.
So it's a balance of proactive management and also pragmatic flexibility.
Exactly.
Are there any other kind of actionable tips for keeping things on track?
Yes. The video actually highlights the value of monitoring what are called key performance indicators, KPIs, that are related to the action plan itself. So you're not just measuring the progress of the actions, you're measuring the progress of the action plan.
Oh, that's interesting.
And two really important metrics that the video mentions are the action completion rate.
Okay.
So that's simply the percentage of actions that have been completed out of the total number of actions.
Got it.
And then also the percentage of actions that were completed by their original deadline.
Right.
And so by tracking these metrics, these numbers, it gives you this really tangible measure of how well your action plan is actually being implemented.
Right.
And it can help you identify areas where maybe more focus is needed.
I like that. It gives you that kind of that high level view of how healthy your action plan management is.
Exactly.
Okay, so finally, the video provides a look at a specific tool, and that's the action plan tool that's offered by Mesotil's QSE. And this really gives us, a tangible example of what this can look like in a digital format. Can you walk us through some of the key features and the ways that it can be customized?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's really notable about this tool is the degree of customization that's built in, which allows organizations to really tailor it to their specific context.
Okay.
So, very simple things. You can upload your company logo, a bit of branding. If your organization operates across multiple sites, different locations, you can list those sites and then manage actions that are specific to each nation.
Okay.
You can also define your own categories for the sources of actions.
Right.
So you might have, customer feedback, internal audit findings, specific project reviews.
That that level of detail, I think, in tracking, like where did this action come from originally? That seems super useful for identifying like recurring themes,
Mm,
you know.
absolutely. Absolutely. And then in terms of tracking the status of each action, the tool offers a lot of flexibility there as well.
Okay.
So it includes, the standard kind of statuses, not applicable, to do, in progress, closed, but
Mm.
you can also customize those to match your internal terminology.
Okay.
And you can even track like a percentage of completion
Oh, wow.
for ongoing actions.
That's cool.
You can also create drop-down lists for the pilots, those people responsible,
Right.
and for anyone else who's involved in the execution of the action.
Okay.
And then when it comes to, that effectiveness evaluation, you can actually define what are the possible outcomes. So you might have, effective, not effective, further action needed.
Right. So it's really adaptable to different organizational structures and workflows.
Hmm.
What about the kind of the core functionalities for actually managing the actions themselves? Like, what does that look like within the tool?
Right. So the tool itself, it's presented in a spreadsheet format. And it features a dynamic dashboard with visual representations of those key metrics.
Okay.
And so this dashboard is really cool. It automatically tracks and displays things like the total number of actions, the number of completed actions, the remaining actions, the percentage of actions completed on time, and then a breakdown of actions by their source.
Right.
Where did they come from? And then you have the detailed action tracking table itself.
Okay.
And that table includes columns for all the essential information. So you have things like the site, the date the action was created, the source of the action, using those customized drop-down lists.
Right.
A detailed description of what needs to be done, the process or the area that it impacts, a progress field where you can provide updates and the date of those updates.
Right.
The assigned pilot and the actors, again, using those drop-down lists.
Right.
The target completion date, the current status, whether it's a drop-down or a percentage. A flag for replanning, if that's needed, the actual completion date,
Right.
the method used to verify the effectiveness,
Right.
the outcome of that verification,
Okay.
and then finally the date that the action was closed.
So it's really a comprehensive set of features that are in there, and it clearly incorporates all those key elements that we talked about earlier for structuring and tracking those action plans. What does the video say about the main benefits of actually using a tool like this?
Well, they really emphasize the user friendliness of the tool.
Okay.
It's easy to set up, straightforward to use. It's adaptable. You can modify it to fit the specific requirements of different companies, regardless of their size or industry. And so I think that adaptability is a huge advantage because it allows you to really tailor it to your unique processes and reporting needs.
It sounds like a really practical resource for anyone who's serious about implementing and managing those action plans effectively.
Okay.
So to bring everything together, what are the key takeaways, for you, the listener,
Yeah.
from this deep dive into the world of action plans?
I think the key message here is that action plans are much more than just glorified to-do lists.
Right.
They're really these drivers of productivity, organizational clarity, continuous improvement, enhanced stakeholder satisfaction, and often compliance with these important standards like ISO 9001. Absolutely. And I think it's really important to remember that, it's not enough to just create a plan. It needs to be a well-structured plan. With clearly defined responsibilities, realistic deadlines, and built-in mechanisms for actually verifying that, it's having the intended impact. And as we've discussed, actively maintaining and following up on that plan is just as critical as its initial creation. Those practical tips that we talked about around regular reviews, setting achievable deadlines, tracking those relevant metrics, that's invaluable.
Totally. And for those of you out there who are looking for a really structured way to implement these principles, that customizable tool that we talked about from Ms. Ados QSE, that provides a really tangible example of how you can manage these action plans digitally and gain those valuable insights through things like the automated dashboards and the customizable fields. So here's a final thought to kind of ponder as we wrap things up. Considering all the various sources of actions that we've explored today, from formal reviews, stakeholder feedback, even your own internal improvement initiatives, what's one specific area, either in your work or maybe even in your personal life, where implementing a structured, planned action could lead to the most significant positive results for you? I mean, take a moment, just consider that. And maybe this deep dive has given you some concrete ideas on where to begin. Thanks for tuning in.